as you're well aware, there are different schools of thought about morality and very different approaches to religion and the religious life. And like everything else, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere have different takes on them. And what you're pointing to is what joins together all these various things, the excesses of capitalism, of rationalism, of mechanism, and so on, is that these are expressions of the will for power, which is essentially the only value, as I've said before on previous occasions, the only value that really drives the left hemisphere. It's evolved to be the one that manipulates. And that leaves all the other values that are to you and me, and I think to all human beings, so important and are so neglected. It leaves them out of the picture and out of the calculation. And I would say that,
I didn't see capitalism mentioned so much explicitly in your book, but I'd be really curious to hear, where the place for the kind of systemic critique of where we find ourselves is.
Well, I suppose the thing about capitalism is that in a word, it's a product of the left hemisphere. However, people will say, well, what would you like to put in its place? And I certainly wouldn't want to put communism in its place. But there are other alternatives we could talk about based on, it would take that to reach a kind of more communitarian way of living would require probably some disaster, I hope doesn't occur, but which would sufficiently disrupt the structures we have now, and people would be thrown back on having to help one another, trust one another, work together, and so on. Because at the moment, we've become lazy. So to go back to capitalism, I think that there are ways of thinking of capitalism in which it's tempered by other things. And so anything that is dogmatic is going to be inhuman and damaging. And so whatever system you come up with, it needs to be tempered, it needs to be qualified. Whatever it is, it's going to have those. And that's not wrong. That's just showing that you're taking into account various different things. But I don't talk about it largely because I'm not myself particularly involved in political thinking. And I don't want to. I'm more interested in the things behind politics than in the politics themselves. So I didn't want to start a big conversation about that, which would have been a whole other book, one which I'm absolutely not equipped to write. So, yeah.
I mean, it is an interesting question. What could imagine what is a right hemispheric system? If capitalism is created by the left hemisphere, what? And I've thought this quite often as I've read your work, is we live in a society dominated by the left hemisphere in doctrine, and it's too far and it needs to swing back. But what would a society look like if it was kind of swung too far the other way? Just to.
Yes.
And I speak about something called imagination justice, which is actually who gets to imagine. Where is the imagination capital in the world? Like at the moment, it's being hoarded by usually kind of tech CEOs in Silicon Valley who all look and sound a certain way and also have a lot of money. And there's a thing around who gets to imagine, which is also not just who gets to imagine, but whose imaginations get to then translate into, affecting and creating and worlding. This concept of worlding from, I think from feminist critical theory, is about how some people get to create the world,